This is the Scenario Radio Show, real talk with a playlist.
And Keena, as someone who works in education, as an educator. What have been some of the things that you've seen, I guess, taking place that sort of push against this type of negative impact that has had where racial identity is concerned?
Yeah, pretty much a lot of the stories that were told in that segment definitely rings true to a lot of the things I hear in classrooms across the country. Um, I mean, it's just really sad that a lot of these things are experienced by students based on teachers who have not been made to grapple with their own identities, to really push and understand their implicit bias and their explicit bias. And so you'll see, especially since George Floyd's death and all of the change that started to come towards people wanting to push towards anti-racism, what you'll see now is teachers really trying to do what they think is anti-racist, but then it may lower the bar. So an example would be, a teacher feeling like it's because the SAT test is racist, racially biased. They don't think that they should teach it to their students of color. Or another example would be teachers trying to teach these highly racialized texts, such as a James Baldwin, such as a Malcolm X, and not do the training and real exploration for themselves to know how to teach that and do more harm. And so that's what I see a lot in classrooms since, especially the George Floyd situation.
Okay, that raises an interesting question. If they don't need to, say for instance, teach, if the SAT is racially biased, as it is, and do they not need to teach it? And if they are, then what do they need to do to compensate for the bias?
I mean, at the end of the day, all colleges and, universities have not gotten rid of it. Most of the schools who have gotten rid of SAT and ACT are actually private schools, not as many state schools. And if you look into like what schools that are, more fiscally accessible to our students, which are state schools, they still expect them to be able to take the SAT and ACT. Scholarships are still predicated sometimes on that. And also states still have to show and still make schools show that their schools, are paying attention to the SAT, PSAT, from those Obama legislations that came after No Child Left Behind. So that's how people get funding to be able to show that their schools are effective. So at the end of the day, that's still the college rigor bar. And all we have to do is just teach students how to take the test. That's what white parents do. They pay lots of money for their kids to be able to take the SAT and get a better score. So at the end of the day, teachers need to feel that that is still their responsibility. Yes, it's a racially biased test, but like every other thing that we've learned and ways we've learned to navigate within a racist society, that's the same thing with the SAT. And to feel like it's not a teacher's responsibility, it really kind of lowers the bar for expectations on what students should be able to do.
Why are we still using things like the ACT and the SAT to measure intellect and entry into schools? Have there been conversations around something that's more modernized? Because I remember we were taking that test when I was growing up, and that's been, well over 20 years since I've been in high school. So are there conversations about something that is not biased, or are the contributors starting to understand the bias and are looking to recreate these same tests in a better fashion?
Well, basically, that's what the conversation is turning into now, why schools are eradicating this as a part of their admissions process. So the conversations are taking place, but it's not been completely eradicated at this time, especially in the state level. And I will say that we all know at this point that the SAT was literally designed to create those types of, inequities in terms of like who gets to go to college and what says is college readiness. So I do think that those conversations are starting to take place, but they are not on a large scale where it has affected the majority of education just yet.
Ingrid, I'm interested in hearing from you. Okay, what do we do? Because a lot of times I think there have been parents who who say things to their children that they mean with all the, they mean to with the best interest in heart, but it's like, man, that's detrimental. Like the one woman who was telling her daughter, "Well, no, you just need to act white." Uh, what do they? What does a parent need to be mindful of or on the lookout for when they're thinking about how they're teaching their children to navigate race in this way?
So this is pretty complex, and if you don't mind, I do kind of want to talk a little bit about it as far as education as well. So it's kind of
Please do.
twofold. So people are still buying into this notion of genetic race. Our understanding of race, in not just in education, but in so many different ways,
Yes.
is that Black people are inferior. And it's being internalized through in parenting, but also it shows up in medicine, it shows up in education. So IQ scores is a perfect example. We've long had this gap in IQ scores based on race, and people will say very controversially that, Black people, for genetic reasons, because they're Black, they have a lower IQ. We see the same thing in medicine. Black people are predisposed to high blood pressure or diabetes. And then we have parents internalizing how they're going to navigate the space, and they're promoting whiteness in their children, and also kind of damaging their child's self, the way they see themselves and self-image, because they're doing a comparison. So, and all of this is connected. So parents definitely should talk about, the truth of the matter. So you don't have to act white, because white isn't a real thing. But on top of that, instead of saying how children can warp and change themselves to avoid racism, which isn't realistic, talk about the, white history. The reason why things are the way they are is because of white people's racism and bias. And that's the same thing in medicine, and that's the same thing in education. When we're thinking about genetic Blackness and these disparities or social determinants of health, we're centering it around Black people, like biologically or genetically, when it is about environment. White people have created an environment that has impacted a Black child's development, which impacts IQ, which impacts your physical health because of stress and trauma. And so we just really need to tell the story in a different way. Instead of focusing on Black people, regardless of its IQ or medicine or your child's behavior, we need to be focusing on white people and white history, and tell the truth about their role in this. Black people don't have disparities because they're Black. Black people have disparities because white people are white. And the reframing of that whole conversation is very important.
And can I just add that I think that another part of that conversation is the work that we have to do to unravel our own mind conditioning. You know what I'm saying? Carter G. Woodson wrote a whole book about it in 1933, and we still have yet to do all the work we need to do. But we have to start paying attention to where we're conditioned to, perpetuate some of those same thoughts. And so definitely something that we have to do is the self-reflecting and the self-work to be able to talk about how we get to those levels of conversation.
Yes, I agree, because that's basically what's happening in Black parenting, that the Black parent is becoming the oppressor in the home.
Exactly.
To try to ease that transition for the child into the oppressive society.
Exactly.
And so that doesn't work. It's not beneficial. And then on top of that, we are also buying into the notion that we're inferior as well. So I've worked with Black parents that will say that they have to spank their children, they have to beat their children, because their child is not going to be able to change their behavior if they don't. And they're basically saying that unlike other children, my child has to be hit to change their behavior. I mean, that's not true. But if you believe the larger society around Black children and Black people in general, there's this trend of you have to be physical with Black people. Black people aren't smart enough to just be talked to. You have to get physical with them. I mean, it's all, like you said, it's all connected to slavery.
They have to be policed.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. KB, did you have a question? You look like you were about to.
Well, I'm just trying to understand if we need to embrace who we are and how we are. Was segregation really a bad idea then? Because in the rise of entrepreneurship and in the rise of putting black faces in these roles where they can then lead and guide and say, well, actually, black is okay because I'm the leader of this company, or I'm the leader of this school, or I'm the leader of this store, and it's okay. I'm just trying to figure out what's the solution, really.
I just want to say this in response, KB. That's all I'm saying. I just want people to understand that every metropolitan area in this country is actually still segregated. We have a guise of it not being segregated because of businesses now in our areas not being segregated.
Yeah.
That is the difference. We still basically live in silos. We still basically live within cultures. Schools are still, even though diversity is starting to come out in the schools, teachers still don't look like students in alarming rates. So we're still in technically a segregated, society. And we've just been given this smoke and mirrors of desegregation because the signs came down and businesses were able to move and groove into our neighborhoods and all of that kind of stuff. And that it actually just, messed up black business. So that's the only thing that was really shifted. It's a lie. We're all still in a segregated situation.
Okay.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't say that segregation was a positive thing. I think the civil rights acts, like the laws and that came along with that, were somewhat positive. But ultimately, when we think about what's going to be the solution for racism, it's going to be white parents changing the way they raise white children.
Yes.
And so as long as we have this lopsided approach to racial socialization with parents of color doing the heavy lifting on how they racially socialize their children, and white parents getting to have a lack of that, or a passive racial socialization or color blindness that allows their children to live in relative comfort despite their history. Other groups of color, they have to deal with their history, right? We have to reckon with slavery. We also have to reckon with high rates, any disparate research around education or criminality. But our white parents teaching their children what it means to not be racist in a real way. And until that happens, then we won't have a dent in racism, because it doesn't originate from us, and we don't have the power to change racism.
So you created it, you fix it.
You fix it. Yeah.
And that's something that I wanted to add, though, because what that montage of people's experiences showed, though, was because of white teachers as well. And so we're going to have a conversation about what we do in the meantime, because at the end of the day, that's the long term, what we need. We need white parents to do that work. But the teachers, mostly white, it's 85% of teachers in America are white. And so those experiences happen with white teachers in many cases, or with white students in many cases, of those montages that you shared earlier. So we do have to have a conversation about what has to happen in the now with the people who are actually in front of children of color and instructing.
Yeah. And I'm also curious about that. And what do we do among ourselves as far as how we perpetuate these racist ideas to our children? Like, especially when I keep thinking about what you were saying earlier, Professor Ingrid, about how young it sets in, when the things that we say to those children. And what was the age? I think you said before the age of 6, or was it around 4 or somewhere? I can't remember.
So children have beginning of their racial identity. And when I say racial identity, I'm talking kind of like a precursor to racial identity.
Yeah.
They can understand that skin color matters, right? And at around age 3 to 4.
So at that age, they're already attuned. And then, you have parents injecting all of these a lot of negative things in there.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm really curious how we figure out how to help
Mhm.
parents to understand what they're doing when they are
So this is
uh,
not about a doing. So let me
okay.
so it is a mixture of things. So um, our brains work in that we receive messages from our environment. So from parents, from family, from friends, from our neighborhood, from television, music. So we're getting messages from everything around us. And so at 3 years old, when your brain is really soaking it all in, I'm understanding that when I go to certain parts of my town that are mostly white, it's cleaner. That white people smile more. That my mother is angrier with me when I'm out in public versus when I'm at home. These are all. It's not so much that a parent is saying something explicit, but it is a combination of the environment in general to include parents.
Yeah.
And so really the parent's role would be, especially at a very young age, would be a buffer to make sure that they are combating the racism that's kind of in the sauce. So
Yeah.
in general, racism is in the environment around your child. And so what does it mean to be a buffer, to be very explicit about their worth, to be very explicit about how things work, and kind of do some radical inquiry around what are the systems impacting us. And so it's not so much that parents, are damaging their children purposefully, or, there's the right thing to do, but it is about parents understanding that it's a racist system in general, and that they're going to have to work hard to kind of embed these positive experiences in their child's life around their racial identity.
Yeah.
If
But can
that
I
makes
add? Can I add to that though?
Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
think that if you look at the work of Dr. Clenora Hudson Weems and Africana womanism as a philosophy that counters feminism, one thing that she likes to mention is that we have to do the work to really examine our own experiences and our identity to
yeah,
understand why we believe the way we believe in response
Mm-hmm.
to the systems that Dr. Ingrid is mentioning. We don't spend a lot of time talking about naming and how we got our names and where our families are migrated from, especially if you're a
yeah,
person like me who's from the north, knowing that my
Uh-huh.
family had roots in the south. We don't spend
Yeah.
time to really understand those deep, philosophical generational mindsets that may have been passed down in our families. We don't spend enough time to be able to really sit and think through and talk through and really understand like how it happened to us. And so I
Yeah.
do believe that parents need to spend some time really doing that deep understanding for themselves so that they can lead their children in the same way
yeah.
that teachers need to develop that praxis as educators.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would
I,
be a precursor to being able to be a parent in that way. So you create those positive racial experiences because you already know what it means, because
Mm-hmm.
you've done your internal work. Yeah, I
yeah.
would agree with that for sure.
Yeah. You've become the filter you need to be beforehand. Okay. Yeah. Whew. As is always the case, I recognize that there's a lot of work there. I want to ask each of you because again, this is something that before I really dug into this particular episode, I did not realize was as pervasive. That particular corner of racial identity. Don't get me wrong, I'm well aware of how race works in a lot of ways. But have any of you experienced any black enough, for lack of a better term, had any black enough experiences at some point in your life? Now, for instance, I'm someone who obviously hasn't. Like, it's not something that ever came up as I was growing up. I attribute it to either my southern slang, my southern dialect, or B, I think the depth of my voice automatically, because I don't take any bass out of my voice, I just automatically assume white people just don't feel like, well, no, he doesn't come across white to me at all. But I don't know what it is. I'm just guessing. But have any of you ever had any of those experiences in any kind of way?
Oh yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
Okay, so what is that? What
So
has that been like? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, a good example for me, I'm from Detroit, which in the time when I was growing up in Detroit, it was about 92% black or so. And so it wasn't white people who were saying those things to me. It was black people. And I would get things like when I would come back from college, oh, you think, your vocabulary is a little heightened or whatnot. And they will say, oh, you think you know better, more than everybody else, or you learn more than everybody else, you better than everybody else. And, that kind of thing, just
Yeah.
based off of, having education or whatever.
And what about
Yeah.
you, Professor Ingrid?
The same education, and speaking proper English. So, and I've had it in both ways. When I was younger, I had really long hair, so that was an issue. So long hair, speaking proper English,
Yeah.
getting the answers right at school. So I got a lot of racial bullying from other
Wow.
Black children that said that I was too white, not Black enough.
And
And then,
I
of
had a
course, I've
student.
also heard that I'm cute to be dark skinned.
Oh yes, I
Oh,
was gonna say you're pretty to be a dark skinned girl. I was actually on a panel at college for that. But then I had a student actually one year ask me, was I mixed because my hair was long, and I was like, mixed with what? I was so confused, and they was just like, your hair is long, and I'm like, okay. So yeah, it happens in many
that's
different ways.
Yeah.
that's wild. I think y'all just answered another question for me. Why I never got that response, because my grades weren't that hot either. KB, you were about to say something before we go to our break.
Well, I just wanted to add that I too have experienced that, oh, you're light skinned with long hair. And that's part of the reason why I cut my hair and went to the natural curl, because I wanted to reject that light skin, long hair notion that is beautiful. And I just wanted to, one, figure out what was underneath all this perm and weave that I put in my head. And then two, long hair doesn't make me pretty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It truly is. And so that was my experience growing up. And even to this day, my mom will say, why don't you let your hair grow out? You're so much prettier with long hair. I'm like, lady, where'd you get this from? Do I just look that bad with short hair? So I know where it comes from, and I know what she was trying to raise me into. And it was something that I totally, one part of it, I know there's other parts that I haven't been able to really deal with, but that's one part that I definitely did try to reject, and it influenced how, as I became an adult, decided to wear my hair.
This is the Scenario Radio Show. Real talk with a playlist.
That's the scenario.